Ever since the landing of Christopher Columbus on its shores in 1492, the island of Cuba has endured colonial rule for centuries, leaving a legacy of violence and instability throughout its history. Eventually, in the early 20th century, a democratic government finally emerged, electing the first non-white Cuban to the nation's highest office of president. This man, Fulgencio Batista, was elected on a Populist Party platform in 1940 with the support of the majority of Cubans. After a short period living in the United States after his presidency, Batista decided to once again run for re-election in 1952 under the banner of his United Action Coalition. Batista's declining popularity eventually led him to seize power through a coup supported by the military just 3 months before elections began, declaring himself a provisional president. The United States controversially recognized this new regime almost immediately, granting legitimacy to this now autocratic ruler. Discontent flared up across the island, and dozens of rebellious groups sprang up from the jungle. Just over a year after Batista's coup, a small group of revolutionaries attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago on July 26, 1953. The assault was easily defeated and its leaders jailed, while many fled the country. The primary leader of the attack was a young attorney who had been running for parliament in the cancelled 1952 elections, Fidel Castro. Slowly, the organized resistance under Castro came to fruition. Called the 26 July Movement, also known as M277, after the date of their assault on the Moncada barracks, a guerrilla war rapidly developed in the Sierra Maestra and Escambia mountain ranges, unifying the diverse rebel groups opposing the dictatorial regime. Other commanders in Castro's revolutionary movement included his brother Raul and the iconic yet still relatively obscure revolutionary Che Guevara, whom Castro later praised. He distinguished himself in so many ways, through so many fine qualities, as a man and as an extraordinary human being. He was also a person of great culture, a person of great intelligence. The faith Castro had in his comrades in the early days of the revolution stood in stark contrast to the faith most Cubans had in their government. The brutal policies carried out by Batista's secret police, including torture, public executions, and imprisonment, effectively backfired on the government, providing a very popular support for the rebels. So horrendous were the atrocities committed by the once-supported Batista regime that then-presidential candidate Kennedy would argue, perhaps the most disastrous of our failures was the decision to give stature and support to one of the most bloody and oppressive dictatorships in the world. Fulgencio Batista murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years, a greater proportion of the Cuban population than the proportion of Americans who died in both world wars, and turned democratic Cuba into a complete police state, destroying every individual liberty. Eventually, due to insurgent and terror tactics, U.S. Ambassador Earl Smith visited Batista in December 1958 to inform him that the United States could no longer support his government. In the early morning hours of New Year's Day, 1959, Batista and his supporters fled Havana, leaving the capital open for capture by the rebels. On January 8th, Castro and his army rolled victoriously into Havana, declaring a new government based on his own socialist ideals. The violent overthrow of the initially U.S.-supported Batista regime alarmed both the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, and his brother, Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, both serving at the time in the Eisenhower administration during the Cuban Revolution. The intense distrust of Castro was partly due to the belief that his hidden political agenda for Cuba would be a communist state, a political affiliation which Castro vehemently denied.
I know you are worried. First of all, if we are communists. And of course, I have said very clear that we are not communists.
This accusation came at a time where America, still reeling from the terrors of the McCarthy era, feared an alliance with the Soviet Union that would lead to compromised American political and economic interests. During his campaign run, Kennedy would explain, "At the beginning of 1959, U.S. companies owned 40% of Cuban sugar lands, almost all the cattle ranches, 90% of the mines and mineral concessions, 80% of utilities, practically all the oil industry, and supplied 2/3 of Cuba's imports." The amount of economic assets the United States had in Cuba through the private sector made many top decision makers in Washington nervous about the possibility of a socialist takeover. During the Eisenhower administration, a radio station on Greater Swan Island was constructed to broadcast anti-communist programs, showing animosity towards Cuba that existed before the Bay of Pigs invasion. The radio broadcasts did not amount to much, as they reflected the selfish interests of the Cuban groups producing the various programs, and also included blatant lies. One of the announcers stated that there were 3,000 Russians in a park in Santiago de Cuba. The residents had only to walk through the park to see that this is untrue. Eventually, after much international pressure to hold fair democratic elections promised during the revolution, Castro finally declared Cuba to be a socialist state, proclaiming, "The revolution has no time for elections. There is no more democratic government in Latin America than the revolutionary government of Cuba. If Mr. Kennedy does not like socialism, we do not like imperialism. We do not like capitalism." The administration later began planning more active involvement in the removal of Castro, with Eisenhower approving of a new CIA invasion plan.
President Kennedy came into office with the plan already in place for an invasion of Cuba and a removal of Castro as president. This plan involved guerrilla attacks and air cover from the U.S. These guerrilla attacks were to be executed by Cuban exiles who had left their country to Florida after being expelled by Castro, and who would be trained by the U.S. Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and Lyman Lemnitzer were in charge of briefing Kennedy on the plan and served as advocates for it, assuring Kennedy of high chances of success. Kennedy decided to keep going forward with the invasion due to the assurances of the previously mentioned men of its high chances for success, as well as a desire to appear to be more against communism than Eisenhower had been, as during their debates he had attacked Eisenhower for allowing communism to fester. Although he approved it, Kennedy remained skeptical of the plan. Kennedy had good reasons for his lack of support for the invasion plan. He recognized that the invasion had little, if any, justification based on either morals or international law, which would make it difficult later on to provide reasons for the attack. The plan also had many factors working against it. There was no reserve force, no logistic support apparatus, and no freedom to maneuver once on the beaches. They also noted two critical and yet unknown considerations: strength of popular support and capacity of Cuban army resistance. That was said by Howard Jones. Unfortunately, Kennedy ended up consenting to the invasion due to the insistence of the CIA that the invasion would succeed, and due to his own strong desire to remove Castro from the office. Kennedy ignored the advice of people such as McGeorge Bundy and Arthur Schlesinger, who tried to convince the president that U.S. involvement would be discovered. In reality, U.S. involvement in the invasion was relatively transparent, with an article even appearing in the New York Times titled, "Anti-Castro Units Trained to Fight at Florida Bases," that went on to give estimates about troop numbers, information which Cuba could have used to set up a defense. The assault on Cuba began with the bombing of Cuban airfields on April 15, 1961. The U.S. hoped that by destroying the airfields, the subsequent invasion's chances of success would rise significantly, as the Cubans would not be able to mount a defense using planes. The planes conducting the bombings were piloted by the Cuban exiles, and had the sign of the Cuban Air Force falsely placed on their sides, in an attempt to create the image of revolution. These planes ended up failing in their attempts to cause serious harm to the Cuban Air Force, leaving most of the fleet available to defend the country. The Cuban military also prepared anti-aircraft guns, which the U.S. had no knowledge of, a fact that led to Kennedy canceling air support for the land invasion, along with the fear of U.S. involvement being discovered. Without the air support, the Bay of Pigs invasion team consisted of just the Cuban exiles who had been trained, amounting to about 1,400 total men, compared to a force of around 25,000 for the Cubans. The invading troops, without some sort of U.S. intervention, had no real chance against the entire armed forces of Cuba. Kennedy and the CIA hoped that, once the invasion began, citizens of Cuba would see it as a revolution and begin to fight as well due to a dislike of Castro and his policies. The discontent of the Cuban population was severely overestimated, however, and citizens contributed nothing to the U.S. invasion. On April 17th, the invasion began, with men leaving on boats to reach drop-off points throughout the bay. Word of the invasion quickly reached the Cuban military, and as a result, attacks began on the ships holding the Cuban exiles before they even landed. To make matters worse, many of the ships were stranded on coral reefs, as U.S. intelligence had falsely identified the reefs as seaweed. The men who did manage to land did not fare much better, as the Cuban military was prepared and prevented the plans of the exiles to spread throughout the country and spark a revolution. After 3 days, the invasion completely came to a close, although it had lost any chance of success far before that. Some of the men who took part in the invasion were killed by the Cubans, but the majority were kept in prison.
The aftermath of the failed invasion had immense consequences for the world. President Kennedy, only an officer a few short months, was already burdened by a massive failure, in part due to the structuring of his decision-making process. Surrounded by military officers when planning the attack, Kennedy is later to have remarked, "The first advice I'm going to give my successor is to watch the generals, and to avoid feeling that because they are military men, their opinions on military matters were worth a damn." The finger-pointing due to the negative fallout of the failure also manifested itself in a damaged international image. The CIA's sponsored overthrow of a sovereign government presented the world with a view of the U.S. as an interventionist power, justifying going to war for its national interests. In a speech shortly before his death in 1963, President Kennedy would later reflect, "I believe there is no country in the world where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the years after the Bay of Pigs invasion, CIA-sponsored assassination attempts began, using everything from poisoned cigars to bacteria-impregnated wetsuits given to Castro by the American lawyer bartering for the exile's release. While Castro did not personally blame Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs, the threat of invasion by the United States led invariably to an alliance with the Soviet Union. After a very close relationship with the United States for decades, Castro would cut off all ties to Washington. Ambassador Earl Warren would later report, "Until Castro, the United States is so overwhelmingly influential in Cuba that the American ambassador was the second most important man, sometimes even more important than the Cuban president." As part of the new relationship with Moscow, medium-range ballistic missiles would be placed in Cuba, setting the stage for the tense and dramatic Cuban Missile Crisis of 1963. As for the exiles captured by Cuban forces, the United States eventually secured their release, returning to Florida with the exception of a handful of rebels wanted for war crimes during their career in Batista's military. Kennedy, meeting with the families of those killed in action, offered condolences, as well as assurances to the grieving family members that the men had not died in vain. Currently in Miami, where many of the exiles still live today, a memorial exists, dedicated to those who gave their lives and were captured by the communist government during the Bay of Pigs invasion.